First of all, thank you all so much for having me here. I'm just delighted to be here. And ultimately, what brings me here is that I've had the very great honor and privilege over the last many decades, since 1965, of being able to talk with literally thousands of people from all around the world who came to the brink of death and were revived and had near-death experiences. And in my opinion, the question of the prospect of life after death is the biggest question of existence, which I come into not from a religious perspective, but rather from a philosophical perspective. My first education was in philosophy, and I got a Ph.D. in that, and was a philosophy professor. Then went to medical school and became a psychiatrist. So, in terms of the question of life after death, which these near-death experiences obviously raise, the problem, I think, is that this is a very different kind of question than science is currently able to handle. Now, I want to say that being a great lover and devotee of science, especially astronomy. But I think that there is a conceptual difficulty where the question of life after death is not yet scientific. It first has to go through a conceptual phase, I think, where we have to think about new ways to investigate this question. David Hume, who, if you don't know him, he was from 1711 to 1776. He was a Scottish philosopher who was one of the founders of what we today call the scientific mind, because of his explorations of the concept of inductive logic and also of causation. And Hume made a statement which I think is, from the person who looks at the question of life after death as a rational question, Hume probably said it better than anybody else when he said, "By the mere light of reason, it seems difficult to prove the immortality of the soul." And, he went on to say, "Some new species of logic is requisite for that purpose, and some new faculties of the mind, that they may enable us to comprehend that logic." Now, historically, that has been looked at as an example of Hume's irony, which it probably was, and probably what he meant to say by that was that it's impossible. Because the logic that Aristotle bequeathed to us has done us very well for 2,300 years. Plus, we think we know our minds pretty well, and the idea that we could have some new faculties of the mind to process this logic seems highly unlikely. And the difficulty that this presents for classical attempts to get rational enlightenment on the afterlife is that all the attempts up to this point to gain rational credence to the afterlife question have assumed a static mind and a static logic. That is, we approach the question of life after death using the mind as we have it and the logic we have. But Hume's pointed out that that's just not going to work. In order to get the life after death question to a scientific phase, we have to go through a conceptual phase first. And I am here to say, and partly as a challenge, because I am a philosopher, I think, in a very deep way. I mean, this is something that I've been interested in literally since I was a little kid. And so I have a great deal of difficulty drawing a conclusion about anything. Right? I always want to wait and get more information and so on. But I am at the point now where I'm going to sort of take the step out and say that there has been a genuine breakthrough in the rational investigation of the question of life after death. And what this involves is actually working with the mind and the logic we have to open up our cognitive faculties to process this question. And though that may seem incredibly difficult to do, it turns out to be entirely a psychological barrier. Matter of fact, I want to say that in 2016, the main obstacle now to rational investigation of life after death is psychological. It's no longer logical. And in order to say why, I have to give you a thumbnail sketch of the history of logic. You know, logic just didn't sort of manifest out of nowhere. It has a very fascinating history. And I can take it back even further than this, but it's convenient for the moment to say that the early Greek philosophers did not even have yet a concept of truth. Now that's very paradoxical. I could spend some time on that and explain it, but it's nonetheless true. They did have a concept, however, of unintelligibility or nonsense. That is, that they knew that certain kinds of sentences were nonsensical. And shamans, for example, used this in their otherworld journeys. They had shaman songs that were combinations of nonsensical refrains and nonsense syllables combined with meaningless parts that would put them into altered states of consciousness and from their point of view take them into another world. Now, so they knew what nonsense was, that some things are unintelligible, but they had no concept of truth. In about 500 BC, the Greek philosopher Parmenides was the first to articulate the notion of truth. That is, that some things are the case independently of what anybody may think about it. That's the notion of truth. It took another 100 years approximately for Plato, thinking about this, to say, well, now we know that there are some sentences that are the case no matter what anybody thinks about it, and that we call truth. Correspondingly, Plato said there are other sentences that are not the case no matter what anybody thinks about it, and these are the ones that we call false. And in making the true-false distinction, Plato also first distinguished between the literal and figurative domains of language, and was in his dialogue in which he did this, was the first person to sort of link the pursuit of knowledge with the literal domain of language, which is what we say today, the literal truth. Okay. Now, Plato, however, was very aware that the nonsensical domain of language was equally important, and he, in his dialogue with Parmenides, was trying to work out the rationally discernible underpinnings by which meaningless, unintelligible language works. He did a very good job of it, actually. He got quite a number of interesting principles. But in the next generation, his student Aristotle had the privilege of codifying the logic that we're using as we're sitting here in this room today. Okay? And Aristotle was one of those people that you can tell by his will was just highly obsessional. And anything that smacked of the irrational to him was gosh awful. So he put aside this prospect of working out the logic of unintelligible language. Now, what I want to say is that I have done it, and I don't want to be bragging about it, but I submitted that to my most brilliant colleagues that I know who have unanimously tell me that I've done it, so I suspect I have. And my book on this will be published in a couple of months in Paris. But basically, what I can tell you is that the reason why certain kinds of difficulties or problems, such as the question of whether we live after we die, have thus far failed to yield to rational analysis, is that what we are dealing with are sentences which, on the surface of them, are perfectly grammatically well formed. There's nothing grammatically wrong about the sentence, there is life after death. But the difficulty is at a deeper level, which is basically that it's self-contradictory. Because if you look up the meanings of the words, death just means the final irreversible cessation of life. So when somebody says, there is life after death, they're saying there is life after the final irreversible cessation of life, and it's nonsense. And this belies our intuition in a way, because maybe we have ideas in our mind that we think, oh yes, the notion of an afterlife brings some images into my mind or ideas into my mind, but that doesn't mean that it has genuine cognitive content, and that has thus far been the example, been the difficulty. I have been teaching a course on the logic of unintelligible language now since 1969, and developed it into a full semester-length course and have done many workshops. And it occurred to me, I guess about 20 years ago, that if we could prepare someone with a logic of nonsense, like with rational principles of meaningless, unintelligible language, not for any other aim than to increase their critical thinking abilities and to enhance their creativity, to get them to thinking in new ways, that it would transpire just by chance that, let's say, over a course of years, I've probably imparted this new logic to a couple of thousand people. And it occurred to me a long time ago that eventually some of these people will just by chance have a near-death experience. And my conjecture was that when that happened, when they came back from their experience, they would no longer say to us, which is the most common thing that people with near-death experiences say, is that I had this experience that changed my life, but I can't put it into words, that there are no words for it. My conjecture was that preparing someone previously with this logic of nonsense would put them in a position that they are able to articulate this in an entirely new way. And I can happily say that it has now happened. On October the 15th, I got a call from an old friend of mine who had been to one of my nonsense workshops about 7 or 8 years before. And he's a very distinguished man. He's well known in physics. He worked with Bell, and also he worked with Philo T. Farnsworth, the inventor of the television apparatus. And he's also, in addition to his distinction in the scientific world, he's very well known as an artist. And so he called me October 15th, and we were just having a conversation. He said he'd been through a terrible ordeal, that he developed H1N1 flu and was in the hospital for 60 days and almost died, wasn't able to eat for weeks, lost a lot of weight. He developed gangrene and lost one of his legs. And so he's telling me all this, and he was very weak, as you can imagine, from this ordeal. His voice was very weak. And he told me that during that time he had had 3 near-death experiences. But then in the midst of all this, suddenly I noticed a change in the energy of his voice, and he suddenly said, and Ray, he said, and when I was in that state, he said, I realized what you were talking about. He said that in order to account for the connection between this state of existence we're in and the other world, he said you have to take the unintelligibility axis into account. So I take this as a confirmation of what I was getting at. And I think it will occur more now because this is kind of out in the open. What this means ultimately is that I think that pretty soon we're going to have an entirely new, genuinely rational means of investigating the afterlife question. Because it would take me a long time to set up this particular argument, but if I could just get to the point of it. One could see that, as I mentioned before, if somebody goes into a near-death experience already with the logic of an unintelligible, this is going to shift their accounting of it to a new form. Now, we already have thousands and thousands of reports of near-death experiences that are viewed through the lens of Aristotelian logic, which makes them a travel narrative, right? I got out of my body, I went through a tunnel into the light, I met my deceased relatives, saw my life pass in review, I returned to my body and came back to life. That's a travel narrative. But if you think about it, a big difficulty with this is that number one, people with near-death experiences tell us that their experience did not take place within space or time, right? But then how do we understand the meaning of a travel narrative if we don't have a concept of space and time? So there's a difficulty there. So we have thousands and thousands of cases reported in that travel narrative format. I contend that in the not too distant future, we're going to have other cases of accounts of near-death experiences that are formulated not solely through the lens of Aristotelian logic, but also that plus these additional principles of thinking logically about nonsense. And what this will give us is parallax. Now, let me explain. Astronomy was my first field of interest. And, you know, we've all heard phrases like, sentences like, it's 4.3 light years to Alpha Centauri, right? But if you ever step back for a moment to think, well, how do they know that? I mean, you can't send a homing pigeon with an odometer out. How did they figure out that one? Well, by the 1920s, they understood from Newtonian mechanics that the distance across the orbit of the Earth around the Sun is 186 million miles. So, when the Earth was here in its orbit, they carefully measured the angles to certain nearby stars, waited exactly 6 months later until the Earth was on the opposite side and measured those angles again, and you could see there would be a little difference, right? And that by calculating it out through the known of the distance of across the Earth's orbit, you can make a guess as to how far it's out there. Now we have a similar method to use with probing into the prospect of an afterlife. I think this is going to cause some difficulty in the area of study of these near-death experiences and such, because the kinds of studies that have been done are mostly narrative-based. I'm going to sit down so I can see you better, actually. That is, what we all love these wonderful stories and the inspirational stories that come from it. And I've heard thousands of them. And I can't wait to hear the next one. And at the same time, even if we had 1 billion stories, that wouldn't add up to evidence for an afterlife. What we have to have is some sort of set of concepts to bring to it, to think about it rationally. And what I want to claim is that now we do have this. And we'll see when this book comes out. Now, I want to stop pretty soon and open for your questions, but let me talk a little bit about what in the name of God is he talking about, a logic of nonsense? Well, it doesn't seem to make any sense. And this Actually, idea is very easy to mock because it seems so highly counterintuitive. But some 20 or 30 years ago, with my work, I reached this point where I realized that if I did a new piece of work and that my colleagues did not conclude on the basis of it that I had lost my mind, then I had better backtrack and see where I went off the rails. So it doesn't bother me that this will probably create a great deal of controversy. But I can sketch out for you what I mean by a logic of nonsense. And that is that empirically anyone can observe that there are certain kinds of sentences that just don't make any sense. But what nobody has ever clearly observed before is that there are lots and lots of different types of those sentences. For example, if I say to you, "'Twas brillig and the slithy toads did gyre and gimble in the wave," that's one type of nonsense. But if I say, "Holiness breeds the vestigial lipstick of spontaneity," that's an entirely different type. And if I go on to say that those men just ate the last cannibal in this county, that's nonsense too, but it's a different format. And over the years, I've identified over 70 different formats of meaningless, unintelligible language, which are all held together by a common universal structural principle, which is that each type of nonsense respects some of the rules of language, but breaks other rules of language so that the outcome is unintelligible. And that means that even though nonsense itself is unintelligible by definition, it nonetheless works by an intelligible underlying rationally discernible principle, which means that we can now think logically about nonsensical things just as well or easily as we can think about things that make sense. Some have thought, well, doesn't this take the question of life after death entirely out of the spiritual domain to say that it's nonsense? And I would say absolutely not. If you look at the history of religion, for example, many of the great spiritual traditions have used nonsense in various ways to bring about altered states of consciousness, for example, or such as ecstatic states, or to talk about the ephemeral nature of life. In some of the Hindu writings, there are nonsense stories, like about the 3 non-existent princes is one of the nonsense stories in the Hindu tradition. And also glossolalia in the Christian tradition, people uttering nonsensical combination of nonsense syllables drawn essentially from their own language. And so it doesn't diminish the spiritual dimension of the afterlife question, nor does it take it now out of the sphere of the rational. And it leaves us open to investigate near-death experiences by entirely new rational means. In the history of science, nonsense has had a very powerful role as a placeholder. That is, what we do is that when there's a big question out there that we cannot formulate clearly yet, we may use nonsense, pass nonsense along for generations in the anticipation that eventually new rational means will arise to work this out. And the contemporary example, which I suppose that shows this most clearly, is the fact that the 2 most powerful physical theories ever invented have been the Einstein's general theory of relativity and the quantum theory. However, if you integrate the equations for those two theories, what you get is total nonsense. And yet, this is carried on in science with the anticipation that eventually these things will be resolved. If in case you are interested, and many people often ask me this, and what have I concluded or what have I come up with after talking with thousands of these people over many decades, is that I must confess that I'm in a situation where I give up. I mean, in the sense that my technique mentally has always been the skeptical technique, which is to refrain from drawing conclusions about anything, which is why, incidentally, the people who bill themselves as skeptics aren't skeptics at all. What skeptic means, essentially, is that you go on inquiring and don't draw a conclusion. So if somebody says, oh, I'm a skeptic about these near-death experiences, I think it's just the chemistry of the brain. What they are saying is, I'm a person who doesn't draw conclusions, and my conclusion is such and such. So, but I am the skeptic in the sense that that's my technique. But just in the past couple of years, I've reached this point where I give up. Okay. Number one, it never has occurred. I've never seriously considered the idea that these experiences are just the artifact of the oxygen deprivation to the brain. Because, as I knew from one of my own medical school professors in 1972, people who are at the bedside of the death of somebody else have these same experiences too. So the bystanders are not ill or injured, yet they have identically the same experience. So the causation has to be something other than just oxygen deprivation to the brain. But not having a religious background and not having any conceptual basis to put these ideas of an afterlife into, it's something I've always found intriguing, but I just didn't know what to make of it. But just in the past couple of years, I've had these really amazing cases. Just, for example, about a year and a half ago, in Italy, I met this very nice surgeon who came up to me after my lecture, and he said, his eyes looked haunted, for want of a better term, like you could tell that he had been through something that really, really had gotten to him. And so he took me over to the corner, and he said that some months before he had been doing a surgery on a fairly young man who was in overall good health. And I forgot what the procedure was, but it was just an elective procedure. And there was no thought that this man would get into trouble. But in the event, the patient had a cardiac arrest on the table, and the surgeon was unable to resuscitate him. And so he was beside himself thinking, oh my God, what went wrong, and what am I going to tell the family? When all of a sudden, he said, the surgery suite doors just swung open and a woman came in, raving. And he said at first he thought she was psychotic. And you know how when you're very stressed, it's hard to make sense of what somebody else is saying anyway, right? So he said he was focused in on this woman's face. He said, what is she saying? And he realized she was saying, my husband is not dead. And she said, I was out in the waiting room, and my husband came to me and he said that you think he's dead and that I should come in here and tell you that he's not dead. And the surgeon told me he was so flabbergasted that he doesn't even remember resuming the resuscitation. Okay, but he did. And lo and behold, after a while, this patient's heart started beating again. And so the surgeon told me that he was there in the recovery room when the patient regained consciousness, and the first thing the patient said to me was, I was out of my body up there and I was trying to tell you I wasn't dead. I could tell you thought I was dead, so you wouldn't hear me. So I went into the waiting room and I told my wife I was going to hear. And I give up. I mean, I can think of scenarios, right, where, and I'm only giving you this as one example. I mean, there's other examples where surgeons and medical doctors have told me phenomenal things about their, in essence, their interaction with the near-death experience of the patient. And, but still, I think that we have to be cautious about saying that this is an established reality. We've got a long way to go on this. And another thing I want to say, and since this is business community that's represented here, which I greatly admire, and I really wish so much that I had taken some business courses at UVA, because I've never been very good at business, and I admire those who are. But I do think that my logic of nonsense has implications for the business world as well. And the reason I think this is that one of my best friends for many years was a guy named Roy Scruggs. And Roy Scruggs was the guy who designed the release mechanism of the Saturn V. And he worked also on the stealth bomber. And he was for many years the research director at Georgia Tech in Atlanta. But concurrently, simultaneously, he was a professor of business at Georgia State in Atlanta. So Roy was really one of the smartest people I ever knew. And he was very intrigued with my nonsense project. And he died, unfortunately, but he was about to get this adopted as a course in the business school at Georgia State when he died. And I'm sorry to say that I can't really understand very well what the implications would be for business, except generally in the sense of it really does tap into an entirely new dimension of the mind that we didn't know that we had. And it's really quite a surprise to learn in 2016 that there are these cognitive faculties there, potential in our mind, that work very easily, but that we have blocked them because of essentially a misconception about nonsense. We think of it as something bad. But in reality, nonsense is not something bad at all. It's something wonderful. The most common context of which people encounter nonsense is recreation, music, and so on. One bright day in the middle of the night, two dead boys got up to fight. Back to back, they faced each other, drew their swords, and shot each other. A deaf policeman heard the noise and came and killed those two dead boys. At least some of you have heard that. And nonsense is a very big part of children's literature. I read in the New York Times recently that Dr. Seuss's books have sold over 600 million copies throughout the world. And I'm sure that Lewis Carroll can't be far behind. So I want to summarize this. The main thing I want to do is interact with you. So that's just an outline of something that is a very complex work. It's taken me many years to work this out. But to summarize again, what I can say is I want to say as a challenge that we do now have a genuinely rational means of investigating the afterlife question, number one, and that, number two, I think that we are soon to be in an entirely new era of rational investigation of this question, which does seem to me to be probably the biggest question of human existence. And with that point, I'm going to just shut up and questions or
just on your last, is there any feeling you had that in the last, let's say, 10 years, there was an increase of the number of people that remember or have had a near-death experience?
Yes, there is a great increase in the number of people who have had near-death experiences, probably for the reason that Stefan articulated there, which is the resuscitation techniques are getting so much better that we're bringing people back from closer and closer states to death. And even with those, we're having still these very elaborate accounts.
May I ask if any, between all of us, somebody has had some near-death experience of you?
I had family.
Out of body.
Out of the body. You too. Okay.
Yeah.
Question.
Yes.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for that absolutely amazing talk. It was riveting. Thank you. It's a hypothetical question in a way, but it relates to your life's work, and it's really a question to throw out to everyone here. And that is, if we move to maybe 2-3 years ahead into the future, and there is more and more evidence and there's more and more science about quantum physics, everything, consciousness. If we imagine a scenario, yes, where in 3 or 4 years' time, in every country in the world, every newspaper has a headlines, scientists prove unequivocally there is life after death and reincarnation is for real. In that scenario, what is your view about how that could change humanity or change the world? In other words, would that change the mind of a suicide bomber? Would it change the mind of a community that wants to create their world? What would be the impact? Thousands of non-believers suddenly thought, it is real.
That is a wonderful question, and it's one I've thought a lot about. And I would like to be able to say that I think that it would bring about peace and so on, but I'm not so sure about that. Because I think that human nature is a very... I think that a large part of that question depends on what this life is. And that has... I've really been thrown into a fit of reflection on that question by coming to realize a couple of years ago that, to my surprise, this does seem to be real. I mean, I just didn't know. So I don't know, but about whether it would change the moral quality of life. But I am absolutely sure that it would change the very nature of the human mind, because in order to process this information, we're going to have to expand our minds to accommodate the notion, you see. So I think that part, and about the second part that you raised too, it's like, what is this life all about? When I was a kid, I loved to read Elie Wiesel, and one of his books, I saw this remark that when I was a kid and I read it, I thought, what in the world is he talking about? But now, since I've sort of come to the impression that there does seem to be an afterlife, his remark rings true. Because what he said was, God made man because he loved stories. And as I think about that as a psychiatrist, I ask myself, what is personal identity, really? What is the unique personal identity? And the closest thing I can come up with is your story. You know, what is your identity except your life story? And now, as a logician, I immediately have to go on to say, well, I can see the objection to this would come, is that what you're doing, Raymond Moody, is you're taking one institution of human existence, say the theater, and you're projecting that out as a metaphor for a model of the whole, and that would be a logical fallacy. But I don't think that, I think that it works the other way around, because from my study of the history of the theater, I think that the reason why we have the theater is that people have that idea in their mind already that your life is a story, right? Because, the history of the theater, to me, is one of the most amazing stories of history. And it's basically, if you go back to roughly, say, 580 BC, Pisistratus was the ruler of Athens. And they had an old tradition of these, a chorus would come and for the harvest festivals. And on one of these occasions, for reasons unknown, a man, Thespis, stepped out from the chorus and spoke his own lines. And it created a sensation, right? So, what did the Greeks do when they're faced with any? Oh, let's have a competition, it's a contest. So, oh, let's have a contest. And so that who can write the best ones of these? First prize winner, I believe, was Aeschylus, right? And his innovation, and he makes it 2. Then, the next sort of winner is Sophocles, right? Who makes it into 3. And then, along came Euripides, and then it's the cast, right? And that took place in 50 years. In 50 years, it went from non-existence to a profession. And what that indicates to me is that the theater responds to something that is already in human beings anyway. Before I went into forensic psychiatry, I did about a year in geriatric psychiatry. And I had plenty of patients with Alzheimer's disease and that kind of thing. But I also had plenty of patients who were very sharp cognitively, but who were there just for some situational stress or whatever. And constantly, I heard from those people that words to this effect that they said that the older they got, the more the impression developed as they looked back on their life that it had been a sort of script, right? And so I think that's why the theater arose so quickly and out of nowhere to becoming a profession in 50 years. Yes, sir?
Yeah. So God must really love you because you have so many stories. We may talk more about it on the weekend, but coming back a little bit to science, what is your idea what the communication was of that man who was resuscitated with a woman? And how did the woman receive it?
I don't know. I don't know. But I can sort of sketch out things that I think are factors in it. And one is which I reached on independent ground anyway, even as a very young kid, is that space and time are not real. You know, it sounds almost psychotic to say that. But that's always seemed to me, even when I was a very young kid, that there's something wrong with this, right? That if you think about it, there's all kinds of quirks and difficulties in it. So I think it's probably to do with space-time, and I think it's also probably to do with the fact that individuality, as I begin to see, which is it's a delightful experience, individuality. But I think in the bigger scheme of things, it's not real. I think that that each of us is, and I am not religious, by the way. Not religious, but I talk to God every day. He's never said a word to me about religion. But the way that I look at this is that God, there's a part of God over there, looking at a part of it over here. There's lots of different parts of God here, and that God is watching all of this simultaneously. You know, what a show that must be. Like it goes back to what Elie Wiesel said, God made man because he loved stories. And he's watching all of them at once and seeing the interconnection. And on that scale, it's got to be a comedy. Right?
Get back to your research into gibberish, if you will. One of the things that most impressed me, we had our daughter when she was just becoming cognitive with language.
Yes.
When we would drive her to school, she would sing these complete operas in total nonsensical ways, but she would do it with conviction, with inflection, like she knew what she was singing about. But
thank you for that. Thank you for that, because I think that partly due to Aristotle's personality, we have developed a sort of collective cognitive defect in which, and it has to do with our inability to process nonsense. But as soon as we open our minds to the fact that the nonsensical is a equally valid and coexistent realm of language along with the literal and the figurative, then we see all sorts of things. And one thing I've noticed for years, because of my interest in this, is that kids about the age of 3 to 6 will start talking nonsense and making up nonsense words for the fun of it, just as a way of having fun. Now, if you think about what that means, paradoxically, is that that signifies that they have mastered language up to a level where they can tell the difference and to use the difference for fun. And another thing is that in learning new concepts, kids often lapse into nonsense as well. Like when I heard a kid yelling one time at a playground, "I've told you 11 times, get off my swing." Or something like that. When we're trying out new concepts, we initially lapse into nonsense, which is on a larger scale happens in the pursuit of knowledge too. It's yes.
So science usually tries to apprehend the world by making sense.
Yes.
Finds and tries to do this in ways that are evidence-based, in ways that are replicable and stable over time and predictable. And we've traditionally said that there is another realm that we usually associate with religion or other beliefs, which is faith-based, and we want to leave the two apart because faith, after all, doesn't require evidence because by definition, right? With a standard of nonsense, how do you see that?
That's a great question, Chris. Thank you. And this phrase that we hear a lot these days, science and religion, it's become almost a watchword or a cliche. But I do think that what we have in these rational principles of nonsense is a bridge between scientific thinking and religious thinking. I mean, I do think that the kinds of issues that arise in religion, we now have a logical way of thinking about them. And so I do think it's kind of a bridge between scientific thought and religious.
Just as a follow-up, do you have a concern, or you must have expressed a concern, that you use this bridge, that it could be extended into areas to basically justify the existence of something using a standard of nonsense that, could be all sorts of, I can't even think of an example, but it could be used, for example, to justify a malevolent God or the existence of imaginary things.
Well, no, I see what you're getting at, but this is, this leaves the world the same. What this does is rearrange the way we think about things. So it leaves the external world untouched. And it seems so paradoxical to say that we have cognitive faculties that we don't know we have. But let me show you very quickly. Let's say that I could lay out 70 different types of nonsense, but let's just lay out 2 here, for example. If I said, that cannibal you men just ate was the last one in this county, right? And then I say, holiness breeds the vestigial lipstick of spontaneity. Now you can distinguish between those 2 types of nonsense to the point where if I said, for example, a chartreuse square root saying the kindness of infinity, which category would that sentence belong into? You see, you can see which one, right? So you have a cognitive faculty you didn't realize you had. And it's basically that when Aristotle put the kibosh on thinking logically about nonsense, that this left these parts of our minds which we can recruit.
Well, so I'm sorry for one last follow-up, but are you saying then perhaps that these categories or logics of what appear to be nonsense today about near-death experience or
Yes.
life after life appear to us today to be nonsense?
That's right.
But one day,
Yes,
that logic will become Aristotelian in a way because
it will open up, that's right. And also it's like, but what you were getting at there, I think, about dangers of this, I've thought a lot about that too, because I've discovered some pretty amazing stuff, which is easy to replicate. One thing I've discovered, for example, in my research, that if you first of all, you have to develop you have to do this with great confidence, okay? But if mustering up that attitude, you can get yourself to talk nonsense to somebody without telling them you're doing it, what it does is it triggers an unconscious mechanism where they will start talking nonsense back to you. And some people then...
I sure hope that's not happening in this field.
Well, I've been trying to refrain from actually talking nonsense. But you're right. I think that there's information within this that is subject to abuse. And that is why I think it's important to get it out. Because if everybody knows it, there's not going to be a situation arise where some one group can get in charge of it.
I don't know if this is going too far, but so what do you think about the idea of, you say individuality is an illusion, what do you think about the idea of reincarnation in different lives? People that believe that we have previous and posterior lives and there is some kind of continuity in the soul or something.
Well, you know, I went to the University of Virginia and I knew my dear friend Ian Stevenson, who studied this very well. And I loved him dearly, but I always, and this is nothing I said behind his back, we always talked openly about this. I think that Ian didn't have a really good sense of critical thinking. He really didn't. So I never trusted his results for various reasons. However, in my own life now, things have arisen where I have to acknowledge that this might be. And I have 2 adopted kids, both adopted at birth. Carter is now almost 18. He is Mexican-American by heritage. We adopted him from Kerrville, Texas. And my daughter, Carol Ann, who's now 15, is a Blackfeet Indian from Montana. We adopted her at birth as well. And also, we don't take these kids to any sort of religious ceremonies. And my wife and I don't talk about life after death. We talk about how we're going to pay the phone bill and what's on TV and so on. But both of my kids have just spontaneously, in a very, very poignant way, related where they were before they came to us. And it's, yes. So I acknowledge, David Hume, the great skeptic, nonetheless did go on to say that he said that he felt that the only notion of an afterlife that he felt that the genuinely rational person could entertain would be reincarnation. And that fits in also with this notion of Elie Wiesel's, right? That this is a play that we're in. Because it makes the narrative aspect of life come out even more clearly. That you have America and China, as my son tells me very clearly. He said, yes. He said, don't you remember? He said, my mother and father and my brothers and sisters in China before I came to you and Mommy. And so,
All right.
yes.